Stephenson. I'm a graduate student at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa, but I'm here today representing a really large team effort, as you can see on the screen. And this is a multi-year effort that we've been working on to be a management framework for upscaling reef restoration in Hawaii. So thank you, Brian, for setting me up to talk about all the pains of permitting, because we're about to talk about it for quite a bit longer. So let me see. Just to give a little bit of place-based context, Hawaiian ecosystems are incredibly unique. So I understand most people here have probably heard of the state of Hawaii, but you might not realize that we actually have some of the slowest growing corals in the world. We also have a lot colder water than most other places in the Pacific. We have large swell events, mostly in the winter, and we're incredibly isolated, as you can see on the slide. And we even have slower growth rates for the same species in Hawaii than you would see in other parts of the Pacific. We also have a lot of endemic corals. We have some places in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands being the most endemic places in the world. So this is really just to say that our coral reef resources are irreplaceable. So if something happens to coral resources in the state of Hawaii, there isn't this gene bank and this other places that we can grab them from like you might have in Florida and the wider Caribbean. Again, they're also incredibly important. So I have a couple different values on this slide. You can see that coral resources are important for fishing, whether that's subsistence, recreation, or commercial. For shoreline protection, up top you see a house falling in at Rocky Point on the North Shore of Oahu earlier this year. For our economy, which is very heavily influenced by the tourism portion of our economy, and also culturally. On the right there you see a construction by Hala Ohia of Ekoa at the U.S. Coral Reef Task Force meeting, as Brian talked about. One example that you hear a lot that I like to use is that the Kumulipo, which is the creation chant in Hawaiian cosmology, actually has the coral polyp as, depending on your interpretation, the first or second organism ever created. So in a lot of ways, these are representing of life and culture within the main Hawaiian Islands. And they're under threat. So these irreplaceable and important resources are under threat. And the state, you can see on the side, we have a couple of the reasons why we see them under threat. And on the right, you can see that bleaching is increasing. All of these, bleaching, overfishing, sedimentation, prevalence of aquatic invasive species, and nutrient pollution are all likely to be on the rise as we continue to go down this time. So with that being said, we have found an increased interest in doing coral restoration projects. And this has come from federal, state agencies, as well as community groups across the state. And because of this, we now have kind of a permitting bottleneck where we have a lot of interest, but we don't have the capacity to meet this growing need within the state of Hawaii. So because of that problem, this project was created to hopefully create a permitting framework for coral restoration within the state that would be a transparent and efficient way to move these projects forward and become permitted. That would be on the bottom, you see responsible restoration without limiting innovation. So honoring that the state is doing, within the state, there are researchers doing a lot of groundbreaking science and allowing that innovation to continue forward while honoring that these resources are irreplaceable and important. So responsible restoration without limiting innovation in coral restoration. So a core project team was formed. That core project team looked over a lot of project documents, and those included things like the Coral Reef Restoration Monitoring Guide made by the CRC and other things made within the state of Hawaii, like the DLNR Coral Restoration Implementation Guide. And we took basically everything that we could from these resources and made a draft evaluation tool. Now, the evaluation tool itself would be a user-friendly Excel document that permit applicants or potential restoration practitioners could use to see transparently what criteria is the state looking for coral restoration projects, and then say whether their project is seeking to meet or not meet that criteria and elucidate why. This way, hopefully the permitting process could be more efficient and more transparent for all involved. Then a scientific advisory board was formed. It was formed in 2 tiers. On the left, you see what we're calling tier 1. It really should be tier 1 and tier A. There's no hierarchy to it, but tier 1 is a bunch of coral restoration and research experts within the state of Hawaii, and that's pulled from both the University of Hawaii at Mānoa and then different federal agencies like the EPA, NOAA, Fish and Wildlife Service, and TNC. They all donated some of their expertise to review criteria within this project. And then on the other side, it's just the managers, because we wanted to make sure that the project product was going to be able to be used and wanted by the people who are doing it. So they had their own space and their own portion of the advisory board to give feedback. And this was done in an iterative process where each tier of the evaluation team was shown the criteria, allowed to give feedback. We went back to the core team, revamped the tool, went to the next tier, and we did this in an iterative process until the second tier kind of had the final say, because they're the managers and they're the ones that'll actually be using it. So we have 86 criteria. I have 12 minutes. I'm gonna go through some of the ones that were really contentious and created a lot of feedback. That way, if some of you are from other jurisdictions and are looking to take up a project like this to hopefully facilitate quicker permitting within your space, that you have more of a roadmap to do so. But I will go through a lot of what we've done today. And so you can see on the left, that's really what our Excel document spread looks like right now. And then on the right, I just kind of have those 4 main documents. So the idea is that a permittee would put through these 4 documents with meeting or not meeting the criteria, and then that would be evaluated with the evaluation tool as well. So starting off with the statement of purpose, this is why do you want to do restoration? And that would be whether or not it's congruent with state plans and strategies. You might have seen Shannon's talk right before this one. And whether or not you want to do restoration because of a chronic or acute stressor. Obviously, we are doing coral restoration in environments that are degraded. And so there's a lot of talk about how we go about making sure that the chronic stressors that our reefs are facing are being either addressed before restoration has taken place or taken into account for the restoration that will be taking place. So what is being asked of applicants right now is for them to identify what chronic stressors are at their restoration site and how they are either already mitigated or mitigated within the restoration that's being done. Additionally, we have, as I said, a lot of unique ecosystems, and it's very varied. So the Scientific Advisory Board's created 2 lists, one of sensitive areas within the main Hawaiian Islands and the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, and of areas that experience a high prevalence of aquatic invasive species. These would be flagged for further review because we do have some incredibly unique ecosystems and ones that have some pretty dangerous species within them as well. Next is the administrative plan, and this is really the who is funding, who is doing restoration. We had a lot of talk about who should be allowed, who should be supported in doing restoration within the main Hawaiian Islands. And so what this really shook out to is that there should be some scientific, or the state feels there should be some scientific expertise attributed to each product, but we didn't want projects from community groups to be limited within the space because communities should be allowed to be stewards of their own resources, right? So the idea is that there should be within each project one person that has experience in experimental design, implementation, and monitoring of projects involving coral reef resources. The quantitative measure of that right now is about 2 years, but that is something that is talked about a lot with a lot of gray area. So it's about saying how an applicant would meet that criteria or not. And then legally, all people on a project team need to be on that permit. And also there is some discussion about making sure that the project, they don't have to have money in hand, but they should have a plan for how that restoration will be funded all the way through monitoring costs, because a lot of times projects might want to start up but might not have the idea for how they're going to monitor those corals moving forward. So just making sure that it's said, how do you plan on doing so? Next is the restoration plan. It gets a number of slides, don't worry. And it starts out with collection. The restoration plan is all about how. So most of the discussion really talked about what kinds of coral resources are the ones being taken for this manipulation and how valuable are they to the wider ecosystem. So it's really split up between corals of opportunity, or COO, corals grown on artificial substrates, and this is split actually between man-made and artificial reef substrates, natural substrates, or coral gametes. And then this is shaken down into criteria based on the coral size, that species rarity or endemism, whether or not that coral is being collected during its spawning period, and if there is a plan for should a bleaching event occur during your project and your project's collection. Also, in a lot of these slides, you'll see photo documentation and aquatic invasive species management. We do have elucidated plans and suggestions for people to do for aquatic invasive species management and photo documentation, but you'll see it throughout the project plan. Next is the propagation methods, and this was taken mostly from the National Academy of Sciences project that was on restoration methods, and I'll try and talk a little faster. It was put through the advisory boards who got to say whether they would red, green, or yellow light it. That was shaken out into the matrix that you see on the right there, and you can just notice that people were a lot more comfortable with ex-situ than in situ, but I will note that's mostly for closed systems. It's not the idea that this would not have effluent flowing in, and we do require a discharge and effluent plan. Next is the outplant plan, and like the collection plan, that's broken down into 3 different versions, whether it's transplantation, larval seeding, or outplanting. Transplantation meaning corals being moved without manipulation in a nursery stage, whether that's in situ or ex situ. And there's a lot of discussion about how far you can move a coral without increasing the chance of spread of aquatic invasive species, pest, or disease. And what was really shaken out in those discussions is about 500 meters is what people were comfortable with, but it's an area of future research that we would like to have a harder number on that's more scientifically based. Additionally, there was a lot of talk about what constitutes a benign outplant material. There was concerns about leaching, about putting plastics in the ocean, and so there was a list that was created about what would be recommended to restoration practitioners to use. And then if you do not want to use something on that list, you need to say why that would be not your preferred benign or non-benign outplanting material. And then for monitoring, we wanted to be able to have something standardized where we could ask, is your restoration successful? And there are entire sessions about that here, so it's obviously a lot to take on. But we also wanted to make sure that community groups and people that are wanting to do restoration are not limited by the fact that they would have to do really intensive monitoring. So what it looks like right now is asking for everyone to measure temperature, mean monthly temperature. It's based off of the Coral Restoration Monitoring Guide, if you've seen, at their outplant sites, and then also a standardized amount of coral outplant metrics for each site that you can see listed, and then a monitoring timeline that has more intensive monitoring in the first year, but monitoring all the way out to 3 years. Last is renewal. These permits are legally only allowed by the statute to last for 1 year, but we wanted the system to hopefully process permit renewals so that practitioners aren't held up waiting for a brand new permit. So with that, we came up with an idea that obviously they need to submit their annual report, but additionally, they would be required to say what they would estimate their survivorship to be at certain time points and then what was found. Knowing that some people are using corals of opportunity that might have lower survivorship, or be doing a method that's more experimental or in an area that might not be conducive to amazing restoration. So how do we allow for that failure without saying that a restoration project is not successful? So it's the idea of saying, what's your expected, what happened, why do you think, and none of that really determines whether or not their permit is renewed, but it really advances the field itself within the state. So this is really how the applicant gets the evaluation tool, fills it out, sends it to DAR. DAR can either immediately approve or deny it, or send it to our scientific advisory committee, which is really our scientific advisory board. They've all offered to continue providing expertise for us to review some more contentious projects. And then the final decision does still lie with DAR as they are the state entity. And this project is not quite done. We do have a year that we were hoping to do some beta testing with some key community groups and different restoration practitioners. We also have a communication plan, and we would like to evaluate how practitioners are involving the communities that they are working in. So with that, my time is up, and I don't think I have any more questions, but you can find me later. I think I can take one if you have one.
1 minute, we go over? Okay. Is there one question? Yeah, go ahead.
So there's a parallel federal permitting requirement process. Are you guys integrating that at some point for the Corps of Engineers and NOAA and all the other HPO and
Yes.
other elements? Yeah.
So as part of our document, that is basically how you should be applying for the special activities permit. We're trying to list who you should be talking to, like what Brian is doing with the federal document, to see whether or not they're congruent, but we are not trying to say, we don't want to be that first door resource like Brian would like for his to be, because we don't want to be wrong, essentially. We would like to have, and I'm not a state employee, but the state would like to